The contract slipped from my trembling fingers. The weight of it crushed me even as my pulse pounded with something far more dangerous than heartbreak. Pure, unfiltered rage. I stared at the elegant signature at the bottom of the page. Alexander Laurent. My husband. The man who had whispered love into my ears, who had kissed me with devotion, who had promised me forever. Liar. My blue eyes darted across the paper again, reading every word that burned itself into my memory. This wasn't a marriage. It was a business deal. A transaction. A calculated move to secure his inheritance. A loophole in his father's will that required him to be married for a full year before he could claim his fortune. I was nothing more than a signature on a dotted line. The room around me blurred. The soft glow of the fireplace, the luxurious walls of our penthouse. Everything that once felt like home now felt like a prison. A soft click echoed through the silence. The sound of the door unlocking. My body tensed, the document still clutched in my shaking hands. Alexander stepped inside, his presence as commanding as ever. Broad shoulders wrapped in an expensive suit, cold blue eyes scanning the room before settling on me. He looked too calm. Too composed. Like a man who had never once feared losing me. He loosened his tie, sighing as if he had just come back from another exhausting day of pretending to be perfect. "You're still awake?" I didn't answer. Couldn't. I was afraid that if I spoke my voice would tremble. And I would never let him see me weak. Not now. Not after what I knew. His gaze flickered over me, taking in my stiff posture, the contract in my hands. And for the briefest second something shifted in his expression. A flicker of awareness. Then it was gone. He was good. Too good. A master at manipulation, at masking his emotions beneath that perfect, controlled facade. But so was I. So I let my fingers relax, carefully placing the contract back where I found it. On his desk between the rest of his ruthless paperwork. Like I had never seen it. Like I was still his perfect, obedient wife. I turned, forcing a small smile onto my lips, even as fury burned beneath my skin. "I was just going through some of your business documents." Alexander's entire body went still. It lasted less than a second, but I saw it. The moment his mind raced through possibilities, the moment he realized what I could have found. Then he smiled. That charming, polished smile that had once made me fall for him. The same smile that now made me want to destroy him. His footsteps were slow as he crossed the room, closing the distance between us. "You shouldn't stress yourself with those things, sweetheart." His voice was smooth, reassuring. He reached out, cupping my cheek. I let him. Even as my stomach twisted, even as my skin crawled. Because now I wasn't just his wife. I was his greatest enemy. And he had no idea. I leaned into his touch. Not because I wanted to. Not because I felt anything but pure hatred for the man standing in front of me. But because I needed to convince him that nothing had changed. That I was still his loyal, devoted wife. His fingers brushed against my jaw, his blue eyes watching me carefully. He was studying me, calculating the way he always did. Alexander never made a move without knowing the outcome first. Which was why he never saw this coming. I forced a small sigh, letting my shoulders relax as if I hadn't just uncovered the most devastating betrayal of my life. "You work too much," I murmured, running my fingers lightly over the lapels of his expensive suit. His lips curved into a smile, but his eyes stayed sharp. "Someone has to." I tilted my head, feigning innocence. "And what would happen if you stopped?" Something flickered in his gaze. He liked control. He liked knowing I needed him. Or at least he thought I did. His thumb brushed over my lower lip, a move that had once made my heart race. Now it made my stomach turn. Then this empire would collapse. He wasn't wrong. But soon he would be the one watching it crumble. I exhaled softly as if reassured by his presence, then stepped back. I was just about to go to bed. "Are you coming?" He hesitated for a second. A barely noticeable pause. But I caught it. His mind was elsewhere. Not with me. And I knew exactly where. "Not yet," he said smoothly, walking toward the bar in the corner of the room. "I have a few things to take care of first." Of course he did. I watched as he poured himself a drink, the ice clinking against the glass. His movements were precise, controlled. He never let his guard down, never showed weakness. But I knew how to break him. I turned, walking toward the bedroom, my mind racing. Every step I took away from him was a step closer to destroying him. I had always played by his rules. Now it was time for him to play by mine. I lay in bed, eyes open, listening. The soft clink of ice against glass. The distant murmur of his voice. A phone call, low and controlled, always careful. Alexander thought he was untouchable. That his secrets were buried so deep no one could ever dig them up. He didn't know I was already holding the shovel. I turned onto my side, staring at the ceiling. The contract still burned into my mind. The proof of his deception, of the way he had played me like a fool. But the game wasn't over. It had only just begun. My fingers curled into the sheets, my heart steady, my thoughts sharp. The old version of me, the one who trusted him, who loved him, who believed in us, was dead. And the woman lying here now? She was going to ruin him. I closed my eyes, breathing evenly as I heard the door to the bedroom creak open. The weight of his footsteps. The hesitation. He was watching me. I could feel it. Studying me the way a man like him always did. Analyzing, calculating, ensuring that his world was still in control. I stayed still, my breaths deep and measured, feigning sleep. After a few seconds, the bed dipped beside me, the scent of his cologne filling the space. Then his hand graced my arm. A slow, possessive touch. I had once found comfort in it. Now it felt like chains wrapping around my skin. He had no idea he was touching the woman who was about to destroy him. I let out a soft sigh, shifting closer, my body betraying the hatred running through my veins. Because I had to make him believe nothing had changed. That I was still his. Even as I planned to take away everything he ever loved. The morning sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting golden streaks across the bedroom. I felt his presence before I even opened my eyes. The steady rhythm of his breath, the heat radiating from his side of the bed. For a brief second I let myself pretend. Pretend that none of it was real. That I was still waking up next to a man who loved me, not one who had used me. Then reality crashed back in. I carefully slid out of bed, moving slow enough not to wake him. My fingers brushed against the silk robe draped over the chair, slipping it around my shoulders as I stepped into the hallway. Everything looked the same. Perfect, polished, pristine. The illusion of a life I had once cherished. I padded across the marble floor toward his office, my heartbeat steady, my breathing controlled. Every step closer felt like peeling back another layer of the lie. The desk was exactly as I had left it, the contract tucked back where I had found it. I didn't need to read it again. Every word was carved into my mind. But the contract was just the beginning. I needed more. I settled into his chair, fingers ghosting over the keyboard. I knew Alexander had a system. He wouldn't keep physical records of anything sensitive. Everything important would be locked behind digital walls, encrypted and hidden. Except he had underestimated me. The soft glow of the screen lit up the dark office as I typed in my first attempt at his password. Incorrect. I smirked. Of course he wouldn't make it that easy. I tried again. His mother's maiden name. His childhood pet. Variations of numbers, important dates. Nothing. I exhaled slowly, leaning back in the chair. Alexander was a man of control. He wouldn't choose something predictable, something sentimental. No, he would pick something that reminded him of what he valued most. Himself. My fingers moved instinctively, typing out his initials followed by the exact date his father's will was read. The screen blinked. Then, access granted. A slow, satisfied smile curled on my lips. Game on. I scanned the files, my pulse quickening as I pieced together the depth of his deception. Offshore accounts, hidden assets, a web of lies thicker than I had imagined. I clicked open an email thread. Messages between him and his lawyer, discussing me. Discussing how soon he could be rid of me. A sharp, bitter laugh escaped me. He thought I was disposable. A necessary inconvenience in his larger plan. But he had no idea that I was about to become his worst nightmare. I copied the files onto a flash drive, slipping it into my robe pocket just as I heard footsteps in the hallway. I closed the laptop, turning just in time to see him lean against the doorway watching me. His blue eyes flickered with curiosity but not suspicion. Not yet. Couldn't sleep. His voice was smooth, unreadable. I forced a small, sheepish smile, my fingers tightening around the flash drive hidden in my pocket. Just wanted to feel close to you. His smirk was slow, arrogant. He believed me. And that was his first mistake. Alexander stepped closer, his gaze lingering on me as if he was trying to read my thoughts. He was always like this, Always analyzing, always making sure he was in control. But I had spent years learning his habits, his weaknesses, the little ways he revealed himself when he thought no one was watching. I met his eyes, my lips curving into the soft, affectionate smile he expected from me. His arrogance blinded him, made him think I was still under his spell. He reached out, tracing his fingers down my arm, a casual display of possession. "You've been acting different lately," he murmured, his voice smooth but laced with curiosity. I tilted my head slightly, letting my lashes lower, pretending to be amused. "Have I?" His smirk widened. "I know you better than you know yourself." If only he knew how wrong he was. I leaned into his touch just enough to keep him comfortable, to keep him believing the illusion. My fingers skimmed the lapels of his suit, straightening them in a way that felt intimate, natural. "I've just been thinking," I said softly, "about us. About our future." He hummed in response, his fingers grazing my waist, his eyes searching my face. And I let out a small sigh as if I was revealing something difficult. "I want to be more involved, Alex. In your world. In your business." His expression didn't change, but I felt the shift. The subtle way his posture stiffened, the flicker of calculation behind his cold blue eyes. "You don't have to worry about that," he said smoothly. "I take care of everything." And that was exactly the problem. I gave him a small, knowing smile. "I know. But I don't want to be just your wife sitting at home waiting for you to return. I want to be by your side. I want to understand what you do." Yes. I watched as he measured his response, trying to decide how much to let me in, how much to keep me out. Then he chuckled, shaking his head like I was amusing. "Business isn't always pretty, sweetheart. Neither was revenge." I reached up, smoothing my hands over his shoulders, my voice soft but firm. "I don't need pretty. I need real." He studied me for a moment longer, his smirk slowly fading into something more serious. "You really want to be a part of my world?" I nodded, holding his gaze without flinching. "More than anything. Another test. I needed him to trust me just enough to let his guard down. Just enough for him to believe that I was still the woman he had fooled so easily." Finally, he exhaled and cupped my jaw, brushing his thumb over my lower lip. "All right, Emma. Let's see how much you can handle." I smiled, but beneath it I was already planning the next step. Because soon he would realize, I wasn't stepping into his world. I was preparing to burn it to the ground. The next few days were a carefully orchestrated act. I played my role perfectly, curious, eager, the devoted wife who just wanted to understand her husband's world. Alexander, ever the arrogant strategist, was cautious at first, but his ego was far too large to resist the idea of molding me into something useful. He started explaining things to me in pieces, never giving away too much at once. But I had learned patience. I listened, asked the right questions, absorbed every detail. The names of his partners, the companies tied to his investments, the hidden dealings disguised under layers of legal nonsense. He thought he was teaching me to trust him. He had no idea I was learning how to destroy him. Late one evening, I stood in his office, a glass of wine in my hand, watching as he leaned over his desk, going through a series of documents. His sleeves were rolled up, his tie loosened. To anyone else he would have looked like a man deep in work, but I knew better. He was always scheming. Always calculating. I set my glass down, stepping closer, resting a hand on his shoulder. He glanced up briefly, smirking at the touch before returning to his work. "What are you working on?" I asked, my voice light with curiosity. "A business deal," he said simply, as if that explained anything. I tilted my head, tracing a slow path along the edge of his desk. "You never tell me much about them." He sighed, rubbing his temple. "Because they're complicated, Emma. It's not something you need to worry about." I let my fingers ghost over the papers in front of him, skimming over the numbers, the fine print, before settling on a name. One I recognized. "You're investing in Callaway Holdings?" I murmured, feigning interest. His smirk widened slightly. He liked it when I paid attention, when I showed him admiration. "They're merging with a company overseas," he said. "If I play this right, I'll come out owning a significant share." "Play this right," I repeated, running my fingers lightly over the contract. "That sounds risky." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Business is always a risk." I traced the ink on the paper with my nail, memorizing the key points before looking up at him, my blue eyes meeting his. And what happens if it doesn't go the way you planned? For a split second, something flickered across his expression. Then just as quickly it was gone. He leaned back in his chair, watching me with that same unreadable gaze. Then I make sure it does, he said simply. I gave him a slow, knowing smile. That's why you always win, isn't it? His smirk returned, his ego swelling under the weight of his own self-importance. He reached out, curling a finger under my chin, tilting my face toward his. Exactly. If only he knew. I let him kiss me, let him pull me onto his lap as he whispered words of power and wealth and control. I let him believe I was fascinated, that I was falling deeper into his world. The truth? I had already set my first trap. The next morning, I made my first anonymous tip to Callaway Holdings' legal team. A whisper of suspicious financial activity. Nothing too obvious. Just enough to make them look twice. A ripple in the water. One he wouldn't notice until it was too late. That evening I returned home, slipping out of my coat as I stepped into the penthouse. Alexander was already there, his tie discarded, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He watched me walk in, eyes scanning me slowly like he was searching for something. How was your day? I asked casually, heading toward the kitchen. He took a sip of his drink, never taking his eyes off me. Interesting. I kept my movements relaxed, steady as I poured myself a glass of water. Oh. He set his drink down, his fingers drumming against the crystal. Callaway Holdings postponed their deal today. I stilled for only a fraction of a second. Barely noticeable. They found an issue in the contracts, he continued. Something flagged by their lawyers. I turned to him, arching a brow. That sounds frustrating. His gaze sharpened slightly. It is. I took a slow sip of water, hiding the small, satisfied smile that threatened to appear. I'm sure it's just a minor issue. His lips pressed into a thin line, his mind already working, already trying to figure out where the problem started. And I knew without a doubt he would never even suspect it was sitting across from him. He thought I was just his wife. He had no idea I was the one pulling the strings now. Alexander was distracted. I had seen him frustrated before, had witnessed the sharp edge of his temper when things didn't go his way, but this was different. This wasn't just frustration. It was uncertainty. And uncertainty was something Alexander never handled well. Over the next few days I watched the cracks start to form. He spent more time locked in his office, taking hushed phone calls, sending urgent messages. The Callaway deal was slipping through his fingers and he couldn't figure out why. Because he had never been on the losing side of the game before. And he still didn't know I was the one playing against him. I kept my role perfect. I brought him coffee in the morning, massaged his shoulders when he was tense, kissed him goodnight as if I wasn't plotting his downfall. I played the loving, patient wife while I continued tearing apart the foundation of his empire. Every move I made was calculated. Every word, every glance, every touch. It was all part of the trap. One evening I found him sitting in the living room, staring at the fire, his expression blank. I had seen that look before. It was the look of a man who was losing control. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat beside him, curling my legs beneath me, acting as if I had no idea that his world was slowly unraveling. Long day? I asked, my voice soft, just the right amount of concern laced into my tone. His jaw tightened as he exhaled slowly. The Callaway deal fell through. I took a slow sip of my wine, feigning innocent curiosity. Why? He shook his head, his blue eyes dark. They found irregularities in the contract. Someone tipped them off. My pulse quickened, but I kept my expression smooth, unreadable. That's strange. Who would do that? His fingers curled into a fist against his knee. That's what I intend to find out. Yes. I could feel him watching me, studying me the way he always did when he sensed something was off. I leaned closer, resting a hand on his chest, letting my touch be gentle, grounding. You'll fix it, Alex. You always do. His tense posture eased just slightly. He reached for my hand, threading his fingers through mine, squeezing lightly. I will. He was trying to convince himself. Because for the first time he wasn't sure. And doubt was more dangerous to a man like him than any weapon I could wield. That night, after he fell asleep, I slipped out of bed, moving silently through the penthouse. I had more work to do. I retrieved the flash drive I had hidden in my robe pocket and plugged it into my laptop. The files I had copied from his office were a goldmine. Hidden transactions, offshore accounts, side dealings he had never disclosed publicly. This wasn't just about his inheritance anymore. This was about illegal business practices. And now I had the proof. I sent an anonymous email with attachments to a financial journalist known for exposing corporate fraud. I didn't include any context, just enough information to raise questions, to spark an investigation. Then I sat back staring at the screen, feeling the rush of power surge through me. He had no idea. He was sleeping soundly in the next room, oblivious to the fact that I had just set the next phase of his destruction in motion. And when he woke up, his nightmare would begin. The morning began in silence. Not the comfortable kind, the kind that filled a room when something had gone terribly wrong. I stood in the kitchen stirring my coffee, pretending not to notice the way Alexander paced the living room, his phone pressed tightly against his ear. His usually composed expression was tight with frustration, his jaw clenched so hard I could almost hear his teeth grinding. He was trying to fix something. And I already knew exactly what. I took a slow sip, letting the warmth spread through me as I listened to his conversation. His voice was low, controlled, but beneath the surface there was a sharpness, a barely concealed panic. What do you mean they went public? He was speaking in clipped tones now, his grip tightening around the phone. That information wasn't supposed to exist outside my private records. I hid my smirk behind the rim of my cup. The journalist had done exactly what I had expected. The article was everywhere now. Headlines flashing across financial news sites, speculation spreading like wildfire. Luxury empire under investigation for fraudulent financial dealings. Alexander Laurent, brilliant businessman or master manipulator? He wasn't untouchable anymore. I turned my attention back to the stove, cracking an egg into the frying pan, as if this were just any normal morning. As if my world, his world, hadn't just shifted beneath us. Alexander ended the call abruptly, tossing his phone onto the coffee table with enough force to rattle the glass. I didn't even flinch. Instead, I reached for a plate, sliding breakfast onto it before turning to face him with a soft smile. "You're up early." His blue eyes flicked to me, scanning my face, my posture, looking for something. I was careful not to give him anything. He inhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his dark brown hair, his frustration barely contained. "There's an issue with my company. A leak." I set the plate in front of him, feigning concern. "A leak." His fingers drummed against the counter as he exhaled through his nose. "Confidential records were leaked to the press. Someone got access to my financials." I widened my eyes slightly, playing my part. "That sounds serious." He scoffed, running a hand over his jaw. "It's not serious. It's a problem, but I'll handle it." I knew what that meant. Find the source. Eliminate the threat. Clean up the mess. But this time he wouldn't find the leak. Because it had been in his bed this whole time. I sat across from him, watching as he scrolled through his phone, his expression growing darker by the second. I had never seen him this tense before, this off balance. I should have been afraid. But I wasn't. I had spent too long being powerless. Too long watching him pull the strings while I danced like a puppet in his perfect, artificial world. Now I was the one holding the scissors. And I wasn't done cutting. I reached across the table, resting my hand on his forearm, my touch light, reassuring. "You always find a way to fix things, Alex." He finally looked at me then, his eyes searching mine as if trying to read the unspoken words beneath my calm exterior. For a moment I wondered if he sensed it. If he felt the shift, the subtle change in control. But he didn't. Because men like Alexander never expected the ones closest to them to be the ones who would burn them to the ground. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "Yeah. I will." I smiled. "No, you won't." The cracks in Alexander's perfect world were widening. For days I watched as he tried to contain the damage, calling his lawyers, issuing press statements, and doing everything in his power to salvage what was left of his reputation. But this time his power wasn't enough. The scandal had spiraled beyond his control, and the media was relentless. Every financial expert, every business analyst, and every investor was talking about him, and none of it was good. I saw it in the way he carried himself now. The sharp edge of uncertainty in his gaze, the tension in his shoulders. The man who once moved through life with unshakable confidence was now unraveling. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. I needed him to feel true devastation. I needed him to experience the helplessness I had felt when I had first uncovered his betrayal. The moment when my world had shattered, when I had realized that everything I had built, everything I had believed in was a lie. So I set the next stage of his downfall into motion. It started with a meeting. A private gathering of his company's largest investors, hosted at an exclusive venue. These were the people who had kept his empire afloat, the ones who had poured millions into his ventures, believing in his ability to make them richer. And they were losing faith. I knew because I had spent weeks whispering doubts in the right ears, feeding them subtle, undeniable truths about his mismanagement, his hidden debts, and how unstable his position really was. So when Alexander arrived at the meeting expecting to reassure them, he was met with cold, scrutinizing stares. And then I walked in. He hadn't expected me to be there. I saw it in the way his body stiffened, in the flicker of surprise that crossed his face before he quickly masked it with his usual confidence. But his confidence wouldn't save him. Because I wasn't here as his wife. I was here as his executioner. The head investor, an older man with years of experience in business, leaned forward, his eyes sharp. Mr. Laurent, can you explain why several of your offshore accounts have been flagged in the latest financial review? Alexander's lips parted slightly, and for the first time he had no immediate answer. Silence stretched across the room. One of the other investors set down a folder, sliding it across the table. It seems the SEC has taken an interest in your company. Would you care to elaborate on that as well? I watched as realization dawned in his eyes. The tension in his jaw, the slight twitch of his fingers. This wasn't just a bad press cycle. This was a targeted takedown. He turned to me then as if finally seeing me for the first time. Understanding crept into his expression, slow and cold, like ice sinking into his veins. I met his gaze evenly, offering a soft, unreadable smile. His breath hitched slightly. Because he knew. He knew that I had set all of this in motion. That I had been playing him from the moment I found that contract. That the wife he had tricked, the woman he had discarded, had become his greatest enemy. And there was nothing he could do to stop me. The head investor sighed, shaking his head. I think we've seen enough. We'll be withdrawing our support, effective immediately. Alexander's control snapped. You're making a mistake, he said, his voice sharper now, a desperate edge creeping in. You're all overreacting. One by one the investors stood, gathering their things, turning their backs on him. I rose from my seat as well, smoothing out the fabric of my silk dress, watching as his world crumbled around him. As I stepped past him, I leaned in just slightly, my lips barely brushing against his ear. You should have chosen another victim, I whispered. Then I walked away. And I never looked back. The ride back to the penthouse was silent. Alexander sat beside me in the back of the luxury car, his posture unnervingly still, his hands clasped together so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The usual arrogance he carried himself with had faded, replaced by something I had never seen before. Genuine fear. I turned my head slightly, watching him through half-lidded eyes, waiting for the inevitable explosion. I could feel the tension radiating from him, could practically hear the gears turning in his mind as he tried to process what had happened in that meeting. He had just lost everything. The moment the investors walked away, the moment they withdrew their financial backing, his empire collapsed. Without their money, without their influence, his company was nothing more than a house of cards waiting to fall. And it had all started with me. The car pulled up in front of the building and the driver stepped out to open the door. Alexander didn't move at first. He just sat there, staring out the window as if hoping that, if he waited long enough, the reality of his situation would change. It wouldn't. I stepped out first, the crisp night air biting against my skin. The city lights reflected off the glass of the building, making it look almost ethereal. It was beautiful, really. Too bad he wouldn't own it for much longer. Alexander followed a few moments later, his movements slower than usual, as if he were carrying a weight he wasn't used to bearing. I didn't wait for him. I walked ahead, entering the building, my heels clicking against the marble floor. The moment we stepped into the elevator, the doors sliding shut behind us, the mask dropped. The composed businessman disappeared. And the desperate man beneath was finally revealed. His hand shot out, slamming the emergency stop button, bringing the elevator to a jerking halt. Talk, he demanded, his voice dangerously low. I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. I just tilted my head slightly, feigning innocence. About what? His jaw clenched. Don't play games with me, Emma. I let out a soft laugh, stepping back just enough to lean against the wall, crossing my arms over my chest. Isn't that exactly what you've been doing to me since the day we got married? His eyes burned into mine, searching for any sign of weakness. There was none. Because unlike him, I didn't break easily. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. You did this. I arched a brow. Did what, Alex? He exhaled sharply, pacing the small space of the elevator like a caged animal. His perfect facade had cracked, the veneer of control he had always prided himself on completely gone. Callaway. The investors. The leaks. It was you. It wasn't a question. I could see it in his eyes, he knew. I had spent so much time waiting for this moment, for the realization to hit him, for him to finally understand that I was never going to be his pawn again. And yet, now that it was here, now that I was standing in front of him as the woman who destroyed his world, I felt nothing. No satisfaction. No guilt. Just absolute certainty that I had done the right thing. I smiled, slow and deliberate. Took you long enough. Alexander moved before I could react, slamming his hand against the wall beside my head, his body crowding mine. His blue eyes, the same ones that had once made me weak, were filled with something dark, something raw. You don't understand what you've done, he murmured, his breath warm against my skin. I didn't move. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing fear in my expression. What I've done, I repeated, letting the words hang between us, is ensure that you will never be able to lie to me again. That you will never be able to hurt me, use me, manipulate me. His jaw tightened. Why? He asked, his voice quieter now, almost broken. Why go this far? I let out a soft sigh, reaching up to brush a strand of my dark hair behind my ear. Then I met his gaze, my own unwavering. Because you stole my life from me, I whispered. Because you made me believe in something that never existed. And now I'm just returning the favor. Something flickered in his eyes then, regret maybe. But it was too late for that. I pushed past him, pressing the button to restart the elevator, feeling the shift as it continued upward. Neither of us spoke as the doors slid open, revealing the empty hallway leading to our penthouse. I walked ahead, my pace steady, my heartbeat calm. Alexander followed. The moment we stepped inside, I headed straight for the bedroom, opening the closet and pulling out the suitcase I had already packed. I didn't hesitate. I moved through the room, gathering the last of my things, each movement precise, final. Behind me, Alexander watched in silence. Then, you're leaving. It wasn't a question. I zipped up the suitcase, turning to face him one last time. Yes. His hands curled into fists at his sides, his breathing uneven. And if I stop you? I tilted my head slightly, a small, knowing smile curling at my lips. You won't. He took a step closer, something unreadable in his gaze. You really think you've won? I reached into my pocket, pulling out the small flash drive, twirling it between my fingers before tossing it onto the bed. That contains every single piece of evidence I gathered against you. If anything happens to me, I've ensured that it goes directly to the authorities. His expression darkened, his posture going rigid. I smiled. Checkmate. The silence stretched between us, heavy, suffocating. Then finally Alexander exhaled, dragging a hand through his hair. For the first time he looked exhausted. Defeated. He let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. I underestimated you. I picked up my suitcase, adjusting the strap over my shoulder. Yes, you did. I walked toward the door, my heels clicking against the marble, my heartbeat steady. As I reached for the handle, his voice stopped me. Emma. I paused, but I didn't turn around. There was nothing left to say. He took a slow breath. Do you ever think that maybe at some point I really did love you? I let his words settle in the air between us. Let him hope just for a second that there was something redeemable in this mess. Then finally I turned my head slightly, meeting his gaze over my shoulder. No. And with that I walked away. Out of his home. Out of his life. Out of the nightmare he had created. And for the first time in a very long time I felt free. The city lights blurred past as I stared out the window of the taxi, my reflection flickering against the glass. The weight of everything settled on my shoulders. Not as a burden but as liberation. I had done it. Alexander Laurent, the man who had played me, had finally lost. And yet, as the buildings rushed by, a strange emptiness crept in. Not regret, not sorrow. just the lingering echo of a life that was never real to begin with. The driver glanced at me through the rearview mirror. Where to? I hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. The Westbridge Hotel. The place I had booked weeks ago. A temporary refuge, a space to breathe, to let reality sink in before I figured out what came next. When we pulled up to the grand entrance, I exhaled slowly, gripping the handle of my suitcase as I stepped out. The lobby was warm, golden light spilling across the marble floors. The kind of place where no one asked questions, where no one cared about the story behind why a woman was checking in alone late at night with nothing but a single bag. The receptionist barely glanced at me as she processed my reservation. Moments later, a key card slid across the counter. Room 1407. Enjoy your stay. The word felt foreign. I wasn't just staying somewhere. I was starting over. The elevator ride was quiet, and when the doors slid open, I walked down the hall, my footsteps muffled against the plush carpet. Inside the room, the air was crisp, untouched, a blank slate. I set my suitcase down, moving toward the window, pulling back the curtains to reveal the city skyline. From here, I could see everything. The towering glass buildings, the endless lights, the world that had kept moving while I had been trapped in a marriage built on lies. I had spent so long fighting for a way out, for control, for revenge. Now that I had it, what came next? A soft knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. I frowned. I hadn't ordered anything. No one knew I was here. For a brief second, my mind flickered back to Alexander. Oh, he wouldn't be stupid enough to come after me. He knew better. Still, caution curled in my stomach as I approached the door, unlocking it slowly, keeping the chain in place as I cracked it open. And then I froze. Because standing on the other side, with a knowing smirk and familiar warmth in his deep brown eyes, was Liam. He didn't speak right away, just leaned against the doorframe, studying me in that way he always did. Like he could see through every layer, every mask. I swallowed hard. How did you? You sent me a text, he interrupted, tilting his head slightly. Right before you left. I blinked. Had I? The past few hours were a blur, the adrenaline, the rush, the sharp-edged relief of walking away from Alexander. I hadn't even remembered picking up my phone. But maybe, on some level, I had known exactly who I needed to see. Liam's gaze flickered over me, assessing. You okay? I let out a breathy laugh, running a hand through my dark hair. I just burned my husband's life to the ground. So yeah, I think I'm okay. His smirk deepened. That's my girl. Something about those words, about the way he said them, made my chest tighten. I hesitated, gripping the edge of the door, suddenly unsure. Liam, I don't know what I'm. He reached up, brushing his fingers against mine where I held the door. His touch was warm, grounding, steady. You don't have to know anything right now, he said softly. I just figured you might not want to be alone tonight. I exhaled slowly, my pulse steadying. No pressure. No expectations. Just him. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't have to pretend. I nodded, stepping back, opening the door wider. Liam walked inside, closing it behind him. And just like that, the next chapter of my life began. The city stretched before me, a glittering maze of possibilities. For the first time in years, there were no expectations, no carefully laid out plans that weren't my own. Just freedom. I watched Liam from across the room as he poured himself a drink, the soft glow of the hotel lamp casting sharp shadows over his face. He moved so effortlessly, like someone who belonged anywhere, unlike me who was still figuring out where I fit now that I wasn't playing the role of Alexander Lawrence's wife. I wasn't sure what I expected when I let Liam in. Maybe I thought the weight of the night would settle heavier on my shoulders, that the rush of adrenaline would fade and leave behind something hollow, something unbearable. But it didn't, because Liam had always been the one constant thing in my life. He took a sip of his drink before turning to me, leaning against the counter. You're thinking too hard again. I let out a soft, breathy laugh, shaking my head. You always say that. Because it's always true. I crossed my arms, leaning against the windowsill. Can you blame me? I just walked away from everything I've known for the past few years. He studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he set his drink down and walked over, stopping just a foot away. No, he said simply. But maybe that's a good thing. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words. It was a good thing. It was exactly what I had wanted. What I had fought for. What I had won. But winning didn't mean I knew what came next. I glanced at the duffel bag he had set by the door, lifting an eyebrow. Were you planning to stay? His lips curved slightly, not quite a smirk, not quite a smile. I didn't make any plans. Just figured I'd stick around as long as you needed. I looked at him then, really looked at him. The man who had always been on the outside of my world, waiting, never pushing, never demanding anything from me. Not like Alexander. Not like anyone. Liam had always let me be. And now he was offering that again. No promises. No expectations. Just the choice to decide what I wanted. I exhaled slowly. You know, I haven't really thought about what I'm going to do next. Good, he said, stepping closer, close enough that I could feel his warmth, steady and solid. Then let's not plan it out tonight. I tilted my head. You really think I can just take a break from thinking? He smirked. I think you can try. I let out a small laugh, my shoulders finally relaxing, the exhaustion settling in, but not the bad kind. Not the kind that came from feeling trapped, from being forced into a life I didn't want. This was different. This was the weight of a battle won. I turned back toward the window, staring at the city, at the millions of people moving through their own lives, oblivious to the war I had just fought and won. I wasn't one of them anymore. I was free. Liam stood beside me, his shoulder brushing mine, his presence as steady as it had always been. And for the first time in my life I let myself believe that the future, my future, was mine to decide. Without Alexander. Without lies. Without anyone controlling me. Just me. And for now that was enough.